Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Keinen, Gott, verlassen, which translates to his own God ne'er neglecteth. I love these old-timey translations. All in all, relatively straightforward chorale. We get into some tangled harmonic tidbits here in the second system, kind of similar to yesterday's chorale as well, but all in all really not too much to write home about after you figure out exactly what's going on. We're going to hop right into the analysis. So 1 sharp in the key signature, we start on E minor, we end on E major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor. That takes us to B major over D sharp, F sharp, F sharp, and B, which is 5-6, a little passing tone here in the tenor. Then we get B, A, E, and B. I think there are a couple of ways you could analyze this. I see a 1-6-4 chord with a suspension here, a 7-6 suspension in the alto, but if you look at this E as a 4-3 suspension over the bass, you could also look at this as a root position 5-7 chord, and if that's the case, you could just change the figured bass to reflect the change. All in all, really achieving the same thing. They're both very similar chords, but afterwards we get E, G, E, and B. So the bass changes and the chord changes to a root position triad, which is why I think that this is a tonic triad of some sort. Regardless, like I said, they're both very similarly functioning chords. It doesn't really matter too much. We're getting ready for an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G though, and I do think the next beat is where we modulate. Next beat we have C, C, G, and E, which is C major in root position, their 6th chord. That takes us to G major, which is also has C major in it. It's our 4th chord. We have a passing 7th in the tenor as well. That takes us to D, A, G, and D, which is implying a D major chord. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. We typically see 4-3 suspensions over dominant triads anyways, so that's good. You see a little neighbor tone that also reiterates the suspension as well. It's a common ornamentation that we see in Bach. Then we see the resolution to the 5 chord D, A, F sharp, and D with this delayed passing 7th here in the melody, and then we cadence on G major like we would expect. G, G, D, and B. Okay, moving to the next phrase, we're going to stay in the key of G major for about half of the phrase, or actually a little more than half of the phrase. It's a short phrase, so it doesn't make too much of a difference, but we do end with a half cadence, more specifically a phrygian half cadence. It's one of the hardest words for me to spell, but we get there. After our G major chord, we get another G major chord, G, G, D, and B, with a passing tone in the melody. We don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral there. Then we have F sharp, A, D, and D. That is D major in first inversion, 5-6, passing tone in the bass. Before we get D, A, D, and F sharp with a passing 7th in the alto this time. This is just a 5 chord in root position. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral here. Then we have E, G, B, and G. That is a deceptive progression, 5 going to 6, E minor in root position. This also is where I believe we modulate to E minor. Again, it's a little bit nebulous. You can say it happens here, you could say it happens here. It doesn't make too much of a difference, I would say, because we know that a modulation is occurring, and we should be in the key of E minor from an analytical standpoint by the time we get to the final cadential chord. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor. Then we get C, E, E, and A, which is A minor over C. That's a 4-6 chord, and that takes us to 5 B major. B, F sharp, D sharp, and B. 4-6 going to 5, typical Phrygian half cadence. Sometimes we see other chords like 2-4-3 or some type of 6 chord, but most of the time there's a 4-6 chord lingering in the texture. The other 2 chords are just in my opinion, more so a byproduct of the counterpoint, but here, no counterpoint, it's just just direct movement from voice to voice, no passing tones or whatnot. So moving into the next section, we have a bit of an interesting development here. Apologies for the eraser marks because I'm just seeing this now. This made it through my first pass through looking at this chorale. We start off with a direct modulation to the key of D major. This A major could be analyzed as a common chord from E minor, but it's not really functioning the way that we would expect. As like, part of melodic minor in the key of E, but in this case, it really just feels like we're starting things off with the dominant of D. But we have this interesting rising passage here with G going up to D. D does sort of feel like a tonic here, which is interesting because we have C natural. So we could make the argument that the end of this phrase does sort of depart from D major to this D mixolydian, which isn't a huge departure, but implying the C is like not a leading tone, but rather a subtonic seventh is kind of interesting. And the more that I listen to the cadence, I think this is not a plagal cadence, but rather a half cadence. And one of the giveaways for me that makes this a half cadence rather than a plagal cadence of G major going to D major is the fact that not only do we have this C natural, but this pattern is very common in half cadences in Bach, where we start on the 1 chord, passing tone, 1-6, passing tone, 5. We'll talk about it when we get to it. But starting things off with 5-6, this is A major over C sharp, E, E, and A. That takes us to our tonic, D major, D, F sharp, D, and A. Neighbor tone here in the bass, and then we have the same chord again, so we don't need to reanalyze it. It's what's on the end of the beat that's more interesting. We have E, G, C sharp, and A, which is a passing 5-4-3 chord. Now that is a less common passing chord to see between two tonic triads, but this is basically just a 7-6 chord with an A in it. The A is more coincidental, I would say, than this being like a unique subdivided chord progression. It's very common for us to see 7-6 as a chord in between two tonic triads in this passing configuration, but here what we see in the lower voices is a 7-6 chord, E, G, and C sharp. It's just the A that changes the context a bit. So 5-4-3 and 7-6 are basically the same chord, and that takes us to, like I said, 1-6, F sharp, A, D, and A. And herein lies the modulation zone, I think, where we go back to the key of G major. At least I'm hearing it in the key of G major. I think it's quite possible you could also analyze this as a plagal cadence. I'm erring on the side of half cadence based on my experience with this cadence pattern that we've seen in the past, but I think plagal cadence could be valid if the C natural doesn't really affect your relationship with the chorale being in the key of D major, and this is in fact a C natural, not a C sharp, I've checked. But 1-6 is going to take us to 5 after this passing tone in the alto. Sorry, not to 5. It is also contextualizable as a 5 chord, which it will be, but it's just taking our tonic triad and putting it in root position. We have D, we have D, we have F sharp, and we have A. So we're just taking that same chord and putting it in root position. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. This is also our 5 chord in the key of G, and that resolves to 1, G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad, G major, passing tone in the bass. Then it takes our tonic triad and puts it in first inversion by changing the bass to B. Another passing tone in the bass before we get D major, which is, in my opinion, a 5 chord. But if you hear this as a tonic, G could be 4 and D could be 1. That C natural eluded me before. I was just analyzing on autopilot and just assumed we were still in the key of D. Okay, moving to the next phrase, we get a complement to, as you can see, I already had perfect authentic cadence written there from my previous take. We have, well, in this case, now it's a move back to the key of D major, but if we never modulated from the key of D major in our analysis, we're just continuing in the key of D. And granted, in the grand scheme of things, I think that this half cadence or plagal cadence, however you analyze it, is operating as this D being the focal point anyways. So you could look at this as 2 complementary phrases in the key of D, or one in the key of G and then another in the key of D. Regardless, we go to D major over F sharp, D, A, and A, which is just 5, 6, and that takes us to 1, G, D, G, and B, which sounds like 5 to 1 in the key of G major, but this passing C sharp indicates that a modulation or a tonicization is in process, but I think this is a modulation to the key of D. G is now our 4 chord. We then get D major in first inversion, F sharp, D, A, and D, which is now our tonic triad in first inversion rather than our dominant, which it has been for the past previous couple of previous beats. Passing tones in the lower voices here, and then we get A, F sharp, A, and D, which is just taking our 1-6 chord and turning it into a 1-6-4 chord, right? So we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. This is just D major over A, and we would expect that to go to 5. A, E, A, and C sharp, and in this case we get a little delayed passing 7th here in the alto, but we have a 1-6-4-5 perfect authentic cadence here, fairly common in Bach. D, D, F sharp, and D, 3 roots, 1/3, still implying D major though. Next phrase might be the most interesting. Actually, I think this half cadence or plagal cadence is maybe equally interesting, but we have a phrase here with a similar vibe here. I think it ends in a plagal cadence because we have this unusual sort of C major to E minor idea going on here. It sounds very odd in comparison to the cadences that we're used to hearing, but I think I have a clear understanding of what's going on here. So we're getting a modulation back to the key of G major at this point. D major, D, A, F sharp, and D. Still our D major chord. We don't need to reanalyze in the key of D, but in the key of G major, I do believe this is our 5 chord. And then we get some quick harmonic movement where we're going to be moving between keys relatively quickly. 5 is going to take us to 1, G, G, D, and B. Neighbor tone in the bass, and then this F natural, if you know about my analysis, you could analyze this as 1. I'll go ahead and put that in parentheses down here, but this is functioning more than just a 1 chord. I think this is implying that we're going to be going to 4, G, D, G, and B. So I think this more than a tonic triad. I think this is 5 of 4. And I think what's interesting here is that this starts a modulation zone where we can continue into the key of C, because C major is definitely going to be the focus when we get to these 3 beats. When I see this C major chord here, E, E, G, and C, this is one of the rare cases where I feel like the secondary dominant is not actually the point in which we, or like, I guess, the beat after we modulate. Like, I don't feel like this G is operating like 5 yet. I feel like here we have plenty of reason to believe that we're still going to remain in the key of G major, because Bach does this all the time. 5 of 4, going to 4, continuing in the key of G major beyond that point now that we're at a 4 chord. But here I do think we're in the key of C major, and this is now 1-6. It's a very interesting pattern, because if you see a chord preceded by its own dominant, you'd feel like maybe the modulation happened earlier, but I feel like this is one of the unique occurrences or cases where the secondary dominant is still pertinent to the key before, and then the modulation happens. Sometimes it works out that way, at least in my experience, and we still have F naturals going on in the bass and the alto. So this neighboring F natural here takes us to another F natural chord. We have E, B natural, F, and D. This E is an accented non-chord tone. This is D is actually the base of our chord, making this B diminished over D, which is 7-6. And like I talked about earlier with this 5-4-3 chord, 1-6 going to 7-6, we would typically expect a tonic triad after this. And that is exactly what happens. We get a tonic triad, or at least some semblance of a tonic triad. We have C, E, and E. But we have this 7-6 suspension going on here in the tenor, which is very interesting, because by the time the resolution happens, the bass stays the same, and it turns out that the chord is a 6 chord. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we're not getting a resolution to our tonic I feel like maybe we're getting a resolution to a 7/6 chord, and what this B is implying is that it will resolve down by step. So really what's happening here is this is where we're getting our modulation to E minor. This is a plagal cadence in E minor, and this is now 4/6. The neighbor tone in the bass, and then by the time the resolution occurs on the next beat, we get the full realization of the chord with C and A, with both E's as well. Another passing tone in the bass before we get E minor, which is our tonic triad. So we get a very similar idea to what we had here. This is a plagal cadence. This has the potential of being a plagal cadence, but I think the nuance makes it a half cadence in my mind at least. But it's interesting when there's room for debate here. So whether you look at this as a tonic triad with a 7/6 suspension, or whether you look at this as a 6/6 chord that's waiting to be resolved, I think they're more or less both pointing to the same direction of E minor in this context. And I think what would have made this more of a one chord for me is if this were A being suspended over the bass, and then it would resolve down G. But because we're going to be resolving down to A, this would make this sort of a tonic 7th chord, which is very uncommon in Bach. We've only seen maybe one or two in the entire, like the totality of all of the chorales we've looked at so far on the channel. But regardless, the rest of the chorale is fairly straightforward. We end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor. We start things off with G, B, E, and B, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion. We then have C, E, and A. Another 4/6 chord, that's A minor in first inversion. And then we get a little quirky progression here. We have B, C, E, and G. So we have another one of these 6/7 chords, right? This potential for the idea of this being a 6/7 chord in the key of E minor that might turn into a 4/6. So the fact that we're seeing the reverse of what's happening here is a little bit interesting, especially seeing 4 go to 6. It's less common to see chords go up a third rather than it is to see them go down a third. And thirds-based progressions, that is, chords that are whose roots are a third apart, are relatively uncommon in Bach in the first place. So this would be a 6/4/2 chord. And what's interesting is that when we see the neighbor tone in the bass and this anticipation in the melody, it's really fascinating because 6/4/2 does resolve off of the harmonic rhythm the way we would expect it to, down a fifth and the bass down by step. So we would expect 6 to resolve to 2 and the bass to be down a step, so it would be some type of 2/6 chord, and that's exactly what we get off of the harmonic rhythm. We have A, still we have the same C, we have E, and we have F sharp, so we do get a 2/6 chord. It is a 2/6/5 chord, but it's very common for 4/2 chords. It's almost always expected for a 4/2 chord to resolve this way. Sometimes we don't. In yesterday's chorale we saw some unusual 4/2 resolutions, but this is one of the more universal trends or stylistic things that we can consider in Bach's chorale writing and how he resolves his harmonies. His 4/2 chords resolving in a very logical and typical fashion. But 2/6/5, even though it's happening off of the harmonic rhythm, we would expect it to go to 5, and it pretty much does. We have B, E, and F sharp. I do reckon this E is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. It's very common to see 4/3 suspensions over root position dominant chords. Anyways, I feel like this G is just enclosing what's going to be the chordal 7th, and that's what happens by the time the alto resolves. B, A, D sharp, and F sharp. So we can just change the figured bass. We don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Anticipation here in the melody as well before we cadence, not on E minor, but E major, E, G sharp, B, and E. Very common for Bach to end his minor chorales with a major triad. And that's today's analysis. All in all, for what this chorale is worth, there's a lot of quirkiness inside of it. Still not 100% certain about the ending of this phrase right here. I'm fairly confident it's a half cadence. It's a valid analysis of what's going on based on my experience with the chorales up to this point. But I think that a plagal cadence is definitely something worth exploring as far as this analysis is concerned, because D really does feel like it's functioning like a tonic here. At least when I listened to it for the first time, it took a little bit of convincing to make me feel like this was a half cadence, but after a while it made sense based on, like I said, my experience having seen this pattern in half cadences in the past, as well as everything that's going on here harmonically. Mid-phrase modulations abounds. We have G, 5/4, turning into what would then become a modulation rather than the modulation happening before the secondary dominant. I think that that's kind of interesting when that happens. It used to happen much more commonly, and when I say used to, I mean in previous videos. I feel like this was something that would pop up much more frequently in Bach's earlier BWV numbers. I'm not sure if that lined up to be earlier works by Bach, if it was somehow chronological, but yeah, here it's interesting that the modulation happens after the secondary dominant, and then it turns into E minor, which is interesting after the 7/6 suspension, which is typically a byproduct of a first inversion triad anyways. So yeah, I feel like this is most likely what's going on. And other than that, this little 6/4/2, or sorry, yeah, 6/4/2 to 2/6/5 subdivided progression is quirky as well. And really, I think that's all that I have to say about this particular chorale. Lots of little quirks about it, despite being short. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content, of course. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.